Hello folks. Now, there's a question I've been wrestling with for the last couple of days. How important is the world in World of Warcraft? And after having hours-long debates with myself and confirming to everyone within earshot that I have in fact lost the plot, I thought screw it, let's take a look down this particular rabbit hole. I will say right away, I think the game's world should be important, but for the longest time it's just been this sad, neglected secondary character that no one really engages with. A world's importance to a game can vary wildly depending on the type of game being played. In something like Red Dead Redemption, the world itself lives and breathes. It's as much a character as any in that game's universe. If it wasn't as in-depth and well thought out, the game would not be nearly as successful as it is. The characters like Arthur, John and Dutch, and the story they're a part of, are of course core components as well. But if the world they inhabit was not as well woven as they were, it would be a dramatically different experience. RDR2 is something I have sunk countless hours into across PC and console since the game's release, because the game's world is its beating heart, and it just sucks you in. Other elements like combat and so on are important as well, but when you trek to far-flung mountain ranges to go hunting just for the hell of it, it says a lot about the game's world design. So, what does all this waffle have to do with WoW? Simple. As time has gone on and expansions have come and gone, the world of World of Warcraft has become far less important. The further we've gotten away from vanilla, emphasis on things like efficiency and ease of access features like LFD, and perhaps most importantly a distinct lack of evolution, the world just withered and died. It's all well and good for Blizzard to throw new zones and areas into the game every expansion, but because of this, no one goes back to the older zones. There's no need to. They aren't updated, expanded upon, or treated as anything other than a time capsule. Why would players make a null and go quest in the wetlands, for example? That place has been the same since 2010. Now, back in 2010, with Kata's release, we saw the first and currently only world revamp. We did get a couple of new zones, but they were mostly areas that were already on the map, just inaccessible due to being incomplete. At the time, this was great. We'd had the same version of the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor since 2004. An update was an amazing idea for veteran and new players alike, but that was nearly 13 years ago. We've had the Cataclysm version of that map for longer than we had the original. Same goes for Outland and Northrend. No updates or evolution of any kind. Why? Why have we not had any development on existing zones? The older game world needs some TLC, and the longer it goes without just shows the player base that Blizzard doesn't care about what came before, and is instead just concerned with getting something new and flashy out. New and flashy isn't bad either, but if the world is going to be treated like a disposable object, then the game is no longer an MMO, at least not a healthy one. If we take a look at the game's timeline, we should have had an Azeroth update somewhere around Legion. We'd spent a couple of years on alternate Draenor, and the IRL time that passed was roughly the same from Kata to Legion as it was for Vanilla to Kata. But we didn't get an update, we got the Broken Isles. Now, I'm not knocking that. I loved Legion, and the Broken Isles was a place I spent many moons, but given everything that happened in that expansion, nothing really meaningful happened to the old world. It is worth noting here that in some cases there have been some minor updates to a single zone if it's related to the current expansion. See Blasted Lands for the Warlord's pre-patch content. However, there are still weird hurricanes in Westfall and Darkshore, despite the fact they should have buggered off after Deathwing was dealt with a decade ago. There are volcanoes erupting in Ashenvale. That was cool when the world was exploding because of a massive-ass dragon. Less so 13 years on. Now, you may be wondering why I think this is such a big deal. Well, the fact is, players form attachments to zones, memories will be formed and fun times had. If they can then go back to those zones X amount of years later and see how the area has evolved, partake in the updated stories and so on, you can play on the old nostalgia whilst simultaneously showing the player base something new. They can go through those old zones and point out, oh yeah, that's where Jimmy died to a spider back in the day, as they also see the outcome of their involvement several years prior at the same time. And despite all its faults, this is something Cataclysm did wonderfully. Westfall, for example, were the Defiers. We got to see what happened after we killed Van Cleef and the consequences of our actions. We got to go back and follow up, and that is so important in any game with a living world like an MMO. Answering the what happened next question is something WoW has not really done well for quite a long time. Even after Shadowlands, we were told there'd been a time skip. Well, don't tell us, show us. Because a conversation between Lorthamar and Thalyssra telling us they got married is pointless if the planet is still on fire because of a dragon we killed a decade ago. It's honestly hard to take the plights of the modern Horde and Alliance seriously if everything still looks distinctly 2010. We need to be able to see that the areas that were ravaged by the Cataclysm recovered, or at least recovering, from that mess. We should see what's happening in Northrend after the defeat of Arthas and more recently the disaster that was Shadowlands. Are there undead elements making life hard for Tuskarr and Firbolg? Maybe Alliance and Horde settlements in the region have expanded and we've actually got thriving colonies in the north. Let us go back to Outland and see how the locals are recovering following Illidan's defeat and Sargeras' imprisonment. Would there be a local demon warlord raising hell, and Akama and the Ashtongue are using the reclaimed Black Temple as a staging ground to wage an open war against said warlord? Or maybe the planet is finally dead and the inhabitants are in desperate need of a new home. And I have no issue with a time skip whatsoever. I just think we need the world to actually reflect that sort of change. Update the capitals again, but this time do all of them. Let us see the Horde and Alliance actually expanding and fortifying their home regions. But what I reckon would be a cool idea is to have a neutral non-player race actually start building their own city. Now, this wouldn't be a hostile area to be in for players, but it shows that the world isn't just red and blue with everyone else in between taking the brunt of the crap and living in tents. But either way, how can the world be important if nothing actually changes within it? Blizzard have not shown us any evolution in the game world on a meaningful scale since Cataclysm. They seem to favour the approach of blowing a zone up for a bit of drama and never going back to it. Have the Alliance rebuilt Nethergard? I don't know. On my screen, it's still a pile of rubble. Are the Forsaken and Horde at large actively trying to sort out the mess that is Lordaeron following the second battle of the Undercity? I don't know. It's completely knackered as far as I can see. Now, Blizzard may have told us in a book or a post or a conversation between NPCs. I don't give a hoot about that. Show me and the rest of the player base this stuff is happening, and that the old world is not being forgotten and only good for some super weapon target practice. This is another big issue with Blizzard's attempts at updating zones, because as I've mentioned, they don't so much as update them to show how things have changed in that area over time. They find a convenient excuse to effectively nuke said zone and do nothing with it after the fact. It really feels like they dislike their own game sometimes. What honestly baffles me is I don't understand why this doesn't appear to have sunk in over at Blizzard. Now, I know Cataclysm was a lot for them to tackle, and they even stated they bit off more than they could chew with that expansion. That's fine, but they've had 13 years to update things piece by piece, and we've gotten next to nothing, and when we do get something, it doesn't actually grow the game in any way, it just destroys it piece by piece. And yes, you can argue that those zones aren't completely destroyed because you can speak to Zidormi and go back to the pre-nuking. But that pre-nuked version is still massively outdated. You could even have the update be that the zone, yes, has been nuked, and instead of a big-ass city, the main settlement in the area is a small town or an encampment, and you just quest out from there, working towards restoring the nuked area as best you can, or helping the people of that area recover from the disaster instead of just completely ignoring the fact it exists. If Blizzard are hesitant to do this because they want people to see their previous work, again, we have Zidormi, and Chromie Time can be used if people want to go back and level through specific versions of the game. But ultimately, the land masses in the game already deserve some attention. Like, let's see Pandaria under the rule of a new Genu Empire or something, for God's sake. This overall lack of evolution has impacted the game heavily and lessened the importance of the world in World of Warcraft because it's become disposable. At the moment, the retail game feels more like instance craft. The world is unimportant and just a nice painting you can take a ganders at when the mood takes you. This is where Classic comes in. In this version of WoW, the world is the beating heart of the game, like I said with Red Dead. The raids, the PvP, the dungeons, the quests, they all exist within the world, and without that glue to bind them together and acting as the lifeblood for players of any level, the game would never have reached the heights it once did. And it seems as we get further away from that, Blizzard seem content to neglect the old world in favour of a new, shiny quick fix that will ultimately be added to the pile of forgotten landmasses at the end of the current expansion. So, I'll go back to what I said at the top of the video. The world in WoW should be important, but I can't say that it is at the minute, at least in retail. And I would go as far to say that until Blizzard addresses the old world and shows it the love it deserves, and that they respect those areas and their place in the game, they will be fighting a constant uphill battle with the player base, because it shows they don't respect them enough to maintain their early and mid game to the same standards they claim to have for their late game and newer content. Dragonflight has admittedly done some good in this area, as it feels nice to be out and about in the Dragon Isles, but that is also partly down to dragon riding and the lack of any hideous borrowed power system. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. Have a think and let me know what you thought. If you wouldn't mind dropping a like, sub, and so on, that'd be grand. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.